The winter morning of January 7th, 1945, broke cold and grey over the Ardennes forest. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber stood beside two vehicles parked on a logging road near the Belgian village of Houffalize, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. One was intimately familiar, a Volkswagen Type 82 Kübelwagen, its angular body painted in Wehrmacht grey. The vehicle he'd driven through 3 years of campaigning from France to Russia and back again. The other was new, captured just 2 days prior from retreating American forces, a squat, olive-drab Willys MB, what the Americans called simply a Jeep. Weber had been ordered to evaluate it, to understand what made this vehicle so ubiquitous in American columns, so valued that Wehrmacht intelligence reports consistently noted its presence in every American unit from infantry companies to headquarters battalions. What he discovered that morning would fundamentally alter his understanding of American military philosophy, of mass production, and of what it meant when a nation waged industrial war, not with precision engineering, but with overwhelming pragmatism. The test began simply enough. Weber's unit, part of Kampfgruppe Paper's battered remnants still withdrawing from their failed offensive, had specific orders from division. Assess captured American equipment for potential Wehrmacht use. They'd done this before with American trucks, with Thompson submachine guns, with rations. But the Jeep represented something different. It was everywhere. American reconnaissance units drove them. American infantry divisions used them for everything from ammunition resupply to medical evacuation to radio communications. Some captured American documents suggested they'd produced over 500,000 of these vehicles. 500,000. The number seemed impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Weber was no stranger to the Kübelwagen. The Type 82 had been designed by Ferdinand Porsche himself, commissioned by the Wehrmacht in 1938 as Germany's answer to the need for a light, air-cooled reconnaissance and liaison vehicle. It was, in many ways, a triumph of German engineering philosophy. Lightweight, barely 1,300 pounds empty. Rear engine, rear-wheel drive like the civilian Volkswagen from which it derived. Air-cooled, which meant no radiator to freeze in Russian winters or puncture under fire. High ground clearance. It could cruise at 50 miles per hour on roads, and its light weight allowed it to float across mud and sand that would bog down heavier vehicles. It had served from the deserts of North Africa to the steppes of Ukraine, but standing there in the Ardennes that January morning, Weber was about to learn something that would haunt him through the remaining months of the war. The test route was straightforward, a steep embankment leading up from the logging road, created by erosion and recent artillery bombardment. The slope appeared to be somewhere between 40 and 50 degrees, though no one had a protractor to measure exactly. It was simply steep enough that infantry had to use their hands to climb it. Steep enough that supply sergeants had been cursing it for days because it blocked a potential route for bringing ammunition forward. Weber tried the Kübelwagen first. It was the logical choice. This was German engineering, proven across 2 theatres of war. He engaged the low gear, approached the slope at a moderate speed, and felt the rear wheels begin to bite into the frozen earth. For the first few feet, the Type 82 climbed admirably. Then the angle increased. The rear wheels, carrying all the engine weight and all the drive power, began to spin. The lightweight front end, with no weight and no power, simply lifted. Physics asserted itself with ruthless clarity. The Kübelwagen slewed sideways, wheels churning uselessly, and slid back down to the road. Weber tried again from a different angle. Same result. He tried building speed, hoping momentum would carry him through. The vehicle hit the slope, bounded upward perhaps 10 feet. Then the rear wheels lost traction and it slid backward, engines screaming in protest. His lieutenant, Hartmann, suggested they give up. The Americans probably couldn't manage it either. This was simply an impossible slope for a light vehicle. But Weber had read the intelligence reports. He'd heard the stories from prisoners. American jeeps went everywhere. They were famous for it. There was something about four-wheel drive, something about weight distribution. He decided to try. The Willys MB sat lower than the Kübelwagen, squatter and heavier. Its engine was in front, not rear. It looked almost comically stubby compared to the more elegant lines of the German vehicle. Weber climbed in. The interior was Spartan even by Wehrmacht standards: exposed metal, simple gauges, a flat bench seat. But the controls were logical. He found the four-wheel drive lever. The Americans had actually printed instructions right on the transfer case in raised lettering. Front-wheel drive, engage only in mud, snow, sand or steep grades. This was a vehicle designed to be operated by conscripts, by farm boys with minimal training. He engaged the front axle, selected low range, and approached the same slope. What happened next defied everything Weber understood about light vehicle capabilities. The Jeep bit into the embankment and simply climbed. All four wheels pulled simultaneously, distributing both power and weight. The front wheels, powered and heavy from the engine directly above them, clawed upward. The rear wheels, also powered, pushed from behind. The vehicle's centre of gravity, lower than the Kübelwagen's despite being heavier overall, stayed planted. Where the German vehicle had reared up and lost traction, the American vehicle stayed level and maintained grip. Weber didn't stop at the point where the Kübelwagen had failed. He kept climbing, 20 feet up the slope, 30 feet. The angle was severe enough that he felt himself pressed back into the seat, severe enough that looking forward he saw mostly sky. The engine growled steadily, not screaming like the Kübelwagen had, but working within its power band, all four wheels distributing the torque evenly. He reached the top of the embankment and stopped, engine idling, hands still gripping the wheel. Below him, Hartmann and the other officers stood motionless, staring upward. Weber drove back down in low gear, the vehicle descending with perfect control, engine braking on all four wheels. He parked beside the Kübelwagen and climbed out without speaking. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before anyone said anything. This wasn't supposed to happen. German engineering was superior. Everyone knew this. It was foundational to the entire National Socialist narrative about German technical and cultural superiority. The Kübelwagen was designed by Porsche, the same Porsche who'd created racing cars that dominated European circuits. It had been refined through years of combat experience. It represented focused, intelligent engineering solving specific military problems. And it had just been comprehensively outperformed by a vehicle the Americans mass-produced in quantities that seemed to defy industrial logic. Hartmann finally spoke. "They have millions of those." Weber had read the production figures in captured documents. Over 600,000 by last year. They're still making them. The implications began to settle like the cold settling into their bones. This wasn't an isolated superiority. The Jeep represented something more profound than just one vehicle being better than another. It represented an entirely different approach to military equipment, to industrial production, in waging war. The Americans hadn't tried to create the perfect light vehicle. They'd created a good enough light vehicle, then manufactured it in quantities that made perfection irrelevant. And in doing so, they'd somehow created something that simply worked better. To understand why this moment shattered something fundamental in German military confidence, one must first understand the belief system. These officers carried a belief system built through decades of German engineering pride, reinforced by early war victories, sustained even as the tide turned against them. The German military's relationship with technology had always been defined by precision engineering, by specialized solutions to specific problems. This wasn't accident or preference. It was embedded in German industrial culture stretching back to the 19th century. German manufacturers had built their international reputation on quality craftsmanship, on engineering excellence, on creating machines that performed at the highest levels of capability. Porsche, Mercedes-Benz, Krupp, these names meant something in 1939. They meant reliability through superior design. When the Wehrmacht entered the war, Its vehicle doctrine reflected this philosophy perfectly. Different vehicles for different tasks. The Kübelwagen for reconnaissance and liaison, the Schwimmwagen for amphibious operations, various half-tracks for personnel carriers, specialized trucks for different payloads, each vehicle optimized for its role, each representing thoughtful engineering solving specific military requirements. The Kübelwagen itself embodied this approach beautifully. Ferdinand Porsche had been personally commissioned by Hitler to create it in 1938, developing it from the KDF wagon, the strength-through-joy car that would later become the civilian Volkswagen Beetle. The military requirements were specific: air-cooled engine for extreme temperature reliability, lightweight, construction for fuel efficiency and mobility in difficult terrain, high ground clearance for cross-country travel, simple maintenance for field conditions. Porsche delivered brilliantly. The Type 82 used a rear-mounted, air-cooled four-cylinder engine, producing just 25 horsepower minimal power, but adequate for the vehicle's minimal weight. The body was angular and practical, with no doors to complicate the structure or add weight. Ground clearance was generous at 11.5 inches. The weight distribution, with engine and transmission in the rear, meant excellent traction in most conditions. In sand, particularly, the Kübelwagen was legendary. Rommel's Afrika Korps had used them extensively across the western desert, where their light weight allowed them to float across sand that bogged down heavier Allied vehicles. The vehicle had proven itself across every theatre. In Russia, where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, the air-cooled engine simply kept running while Soviet vehicles froze. In France, during the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1940, Kübelwagens had raced ahead of panzer columns, scouting routes and maintaining communications. In Yugoslavia's mountains, they'd navigated partisan-held territory where roads barely existed. By January 1945, the Kübelwagen had become as familiar to German soldiers as their own rifles. Over 50,000 had been produced. It was simply part of the landscape of German military operations, and it was this familiarity, this proven record, that made the Jeep's performance so psychologically devastating. Because the Willys MB represented everything German engineering doctrine rejected. The Americans had approached their light vehicle requirement with radically different assumptions. In 1940, the US Army had solicited bids for a quarter-ton reconnaissance vehicle with specific requirements: four-wheel drive, 750-pound payload capacity, ability to traverse rough terrain, wheelbase no longer than 75 inches. The requirements came not from engineering elegance but from practical military need as observed in European combat. American planners had watched the war in Poland and France and concluded they needed a go-anywhere light vehicle that could be produced quickly and maintained easily. Willys Overland won the contract with a design that prioritized function over form. The MB was heavier than the Kübelwagen, over 2,000 pounds empty, more than 50% heavier than the German vehicle. Its engine was larger and liquid-cooled, a 60-horsepower four-cylinder, more than twice the Kübelwagen's power. This meant radiators, water pumps, thermostats, components that could freeze or leak or fail. German engineers would have rejected this complexity as unnecessary and vulnerable, but the Americans had reasoned differently. The extra weight came with advantages: structural strength, payload capacity, stability. The liquid-cooled engine produced far more power, which meant the vehicle could carry heavier loads up steeper grades. And most critically, the Jeep was four-wheel drive, not as an optional feature or specialized variant, but as standard equipment. This was the crucial difference Weber and his officers discovered on that slope in the Ardennes. Four-wheel drive wasn't new technology in 1945. The concept dated back decades, but it was complex, expensive, and heavy. German military planners had judged it unnecessary for light vehicles. The Kübelwagen's light weight provided adequate mobility for reconnaissance work, and specialized half-tracks handled heavy cargo. Four-wheel drive added complexity, weight, and manufacturing cost for marginal benefit in most conditions. American planners had calculated differently. They'd decided the benefits of four-wheel drive better traction in mud, snow, sand, and steep terrain justified the complexity and cost, especially if the vehicle was going to be truly universal. And universal was the key American insight. The Jeep wasn't designed as a reconnaissance vehicle that could occasionally haul supplies. It was designed to do everything: reconnaissance, liaison, cargo, medical evacuation, weapons platform, cable laying, radio communications, even command post. Make one vehicle that did everything adequately, then manufacture it in such quantities that every unit had as many as they needed. This was mass production theory applied to military equipment. Henry Ford had proven you could make millions of identical cars if you standardized design and optimized manufacturing. The Americans applied this to warfare. Don't make perfect vehicles in limited numbers. Make good enough vehicles in overwhelming numbers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By January 1945, this philosophy was producing results that seemed impossible to German officers like Weber. American factories were delivering over 600,000 Jeeps to US forces and allies worldwide. 600,000. The entire German economy couldn't produce 600,000 of anything except perhaps rifles and ammunition. The Wehrmacht's total production of all types of trucks and light vehicles combined, across 6 years of war, barely reached 700,000 units. The Americans were producing almost that many of one single vehicle type, and now Weber understood they weren't producing an inferior product to reach that quantity. They'd somehow created something that simply worked better. The testing didn't stop with that single slope. Weber spent the next 3 days putting both vehicles through systematic comparison, driven by a need to understand exactly what the Americans had achieved. What emerged was a portrait not of one vehicle being slightly better than another, but of two entirely different philosophies of military engineering producing vehicles that excelled in completely different ways. The Kübelwagen retained advantages. It was lighter, more fuel-efficient, simpler to maintain. Its air-cooled engine truly was superior in extreme cold, no coolant to freeze, no radiator to rupture. In pure sand, the Type 82's lightweight still gave it an edge, allowing it to float across surfaces where the heavier Jeep would sink. For a reconnaissance vehicle operating alone, scouting ahead of advancing forces in open terrain, the Kübelwagen remained excellent. But the Jeep was better at almost everything else. Payload capacity was dramatically higher. The Kübelwagen was rated for 500 pounds of cargo plus crew. The Jeep could carry 800 pounds easily, and American units routinely overloaded them to half a ton without mechanical failure. This difference wasn't academic. It meant the Jeep could haul ammunition, water, radios, wounded men, all the material necessities of combat that actually determined whether a unit could fight effectively. Towing capacity was similarly disparate. The Kübelwagen could manage light trailers on good roads. The Jeep routinely towed artillery pieces. American airborne units dropped Jeeps by parachute specifically to tow their 75mm pack howitzers. Weber had seen captured photographs showing Jeeps towing anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft guns, even light loads that should have required trucks. The vehicle's power-to-weight ratio and four-wheel drive made it a miniature tow vehicle. And then there was that four-wheel drive itself, the feature that had allowed it to climb that impossible slope. Weber began to understand why four-wheel drive mattered so profoundly in practice. It wasn't just about steep hills. Four-wheel drive meant better traction in mud, which meant mobility after rain, during spring thaws, in river valleys, all the conditions where armies actually operated. It meant the vehicle could pull itself through conditions that would stop a two-wheel drive vehicle cold. American units didn't need to wait for roads to dry or for engineers to corduroy muddy tracks. They simply engaged four-wheel drive and kept moving. This translated to operational tempo. German units, even when they had fuel and functioning vehicles, often had to wait for road conditions to improve. American units didn't wait. They moved regardless of weather, regardless of terrain. The difference between two-wheel and four-wheel drive wasn't just mechanical, it was strategic. But the most psychologically devastating realization came when Weber examined the Jeep's construction itself. The vehicle was almost deliberately crude by German standards. The body panels were simple stamped steel, flat where they could be flat, with minimal forming or shaping. No compound curves that required expensive dies or skilled fabrication. The frame was basic channel steel, straight and simple. The engine was conventional to the point of banality, a side-valve four-cylinder that any mechanic who'd worked on farm tractors would recognize immediately. The transmission and transfer case were robust but unsophisticated, built for durability rather than efficiency. Looking at the Jeep's construction, a German engineer would instinctively see waste. The vehicle was overbuilt for its role, heavier components than necessary, safety margins larger than optimal, materials used in greater quantities than minimum requirements demanded. It represented inefficient use of steel, rubber, and machining time. But this waste was deliberate, and it served a purpose German planners had never fully considered. The Jeep was designed to be manufactured by workers who'd never built vehicles before. Those simple body panels could be stamped in factories that had previously made appliances or furniture. That basic frame could be welded by workers who'd learned the skill in a few weeks. That conventional engine used standard production techniques that tens of thousands of American machinists already knew. The entire vehicle was engineered around the assumption that production would be distributed across hundreds of facilities, assembled by newly trained workers, maintained by soldiers who might have been farmers or shopkeepers 6 months earlier. This was why the Americans could produce 600,000 of them. They deliberately sacrificed engineering elegance for manufacturing scalability. The Kübelwagen, beautiful as its design was, required Porsche's specific expertise to engineer and specialized factories to produce. You couldn't just hand the drawings to any industrial plant and expect them to manufacture it successfully. The Americans had created a vehicle that any competent industrial nation could build, then built it in quantities that leveraged America's massive manufacturing capacity. Weber wrote his report over 2 evenings in a commandeered Belgian farmhouse, by candlelight, as his unit continued its slow withdrawal eastward. The report was factual, detailed, deliberately unemotional. He described the test results. He listed the Jeep's specifications. He noted its advantages and its few disadvantages. He recommended that captured Jeeps be retained for Wehrmacht use wherever possible, as they were superior to the Kübelwagen for most military tasks. What he didn't write, because military reports don't include existential dread, was the conclusion that had been forming since that morning on the slope. Germany had already lost the war, not because of individual battles or strategic decisions, but because the Americans could produce 600,000 vehicles that were simply better than Germany's best light vehicle, and still have industrial capacity left over for tanks, trucks, ships, aircraft, and everything else modern war required. Germany's entire production of all military vehicles, across the entire war, was less than what America produced of this one type. And the Jeep wasn't even America's main effort, it was almost an afterthought, a light utility vehicle that existed alongside vast fleets of trucks, half-tracks, tanks, and landing craft. The mathematics were straightforward and merciless. Germany's total steel production in 1944 was around 28 million tons. America's was 89 million tons, more than triple. Germany's total electricity generation was 63 billion kilowatt-hours. America's was 316 billion kilowatt-hours, 5 times higher. These disparities translated directly into military production. For every tank Germany built, America built 5. For every aircraft, America built 3. For every naval vessel, the ratio was even more lopsided. German propaganda had explained this away for years. American equipment was inferior, crude, mass-produced without the precision engineering that made. German weapons superior, quality over quantity. 1 German soldier was worth 10 Americans. 1 Tiger tank was worth 5 Shermans. The superiority of German arms would overcome material disadvantages. And then you climbed into an American Jeep and discovered it could do things your German vehicle couldn't, despite being crude mass production. Despite being designed for manufacture by semi-skilled workers, despite everything the propaganda had taught you about American industrial inferiority. If they could do this with a light utility vehicle, something not even central to combat power, what did it mean for everything else? Weber knew what it meant. So did every German officer who'd fought on the Eastern Front and seen Soviet production overwhelm German technical superiority through sheer mass. So did every Luftwaffe pilot who'd watched American bomber formations darken the sky, escorted by fighters that came in numbers that made tactical victory meaningless. So did every U-boat commander who'd watched American shipyards produce destroyers and escort carriers faster than submarines could sink them. The Jeep's performance on that slope was simply one more piece of evidence in a case that had already been conclusively proven. Industrial capacity determined modern war's outcome, and America's industrial capacity was so far beyond Germany's that no amount of tactical skill or technical innovation could bridge the gap. This realization had been spreading through the Wehrmacht since 1943, slowly, officer to officer, unit to unit, as the material evidence became impossible to ignore. It wasn't defeatism or poor morale in the traditional sense. German units still fought effectively, soldiers still followed orders. But underneath the discipline and the training and the institutional momentum, there was a growing awareness that they were fighting arithmetic, and arithmetic didn't care about courage or skill or ideological conviction. The Jeep represented something more personally devastating than strategic hopelessness, though. It represented the collapse of a specific German cultural belief that German engineering was inherently superior, that precision and craft and thoughtful design would always triumph over crude mass production. This belief had deep roots in German national identity. Since the late 19th century, German manufacturing had built its reputation on exactly these qualities. Made in Germany had become synonymous with quality, with engineering excellence, with products that worked better and lasted longer than cheaper alternatives. This wasn't just marketing, it was measurable reality in everything from machine tools to cameras to automobiles. German universities trained engineers more thoroughly than anywhere else. German factories maintained higher standards. German products simply worked better. The National Socialist ideology had embraced and amplified this belief, weaving it into their broader narrative about German cultural and racial superiority. German engineering supremacy was presented as evidence of Aryan excellence, proof that Germanic peoples were destined to lead European civilization. The early war victories seemed to confirm this. German panzers had crushed Polish and French armies. German aircraft had dominated European skies. German submarines had terrorized the Atlantic. Superior German engineering, combined with superior German fighting spirit, had achieved what seemed impossible. But by January 1945, that narrative was collapsing under the weight of material evidence, and the Jeep was perfect evidence precisely because it was so mundane. This wasn't some revolutionary weapon system that required exotic materials or unprecedented scientific breakthroughs. It was a quarter-ton truck. The Americans had simply approached the problem differently, engineered it for mass production rather than individual excellence, and in doing so had created something that worked better while being easier and cheaper to manufacture. This suggested something terrifying, that German engineering philosophy itself was flawed, that the focus on precision and optimization had missed something crucial about industrial warfare, that the Americans' cruder approach was actually superior for the kind of total war the 20th century demanded. Weber's report made its way up the chain of command, was read by staff officers at division headquarters, was filed alongside hundreds of other reports about captured American equipment. Some officers dismissed it. One vehicle's performance didn't invalidate decades of German engineering excellence. Others absorbed it silently, adding it to their private catalogue of evidence that the war was lost. But the Jeep itself, and thousands like it captured across the Western Front, continued to provide daily, tangible proof of American industrial philosophy's success. Wehrmacht units that captured jeeps in working condition universally chose to use them in preference to their own vehicles. German mechanics who maintained them marveled at how simple they were to repair, how interchangeable the parts were, how the design prioritized field maintainability over engineering elegance. German soldiers who drove them appreciated the power, the reliability, the sheer capability. And every time a German soldier chose to drive a captured jeep instead of a Kübelwagen, it was an implicit admission that American engineering had produced something superior. The vehicle's ubiquity in American forces made the comparison inescapable. By 1945, the Jeep had become essentially universal in U.S. military operations. Every American infantry division had over 200 of them. Mechanized and armored divisions had even more. They appeared in every role imaginable: reconnaissance, liaison, cargo, medical evacuation, radio communications, cable laying, weapons platforms, mounting everything from machine guns to recoilless rifles. American commanders used them as personal transportation. American infantry squads used them to haul ammunition forward. American medics used them as ambulances, strapping litters to the hood and fenders. German soldiers saw them constantly, in captured photographs, in reconnaissance footage. Abandoned on roadsides when American units advanced faster than disabled vehicles could be recovered, intact in motor pools overrun during German counterattacks. The Jeep was simply everywhere in American operations, and its presence constantly reminded German forces of the industrial disparity they faced. This psychological weight was compounded by the vehicle's symbolic role. The Jeep had become, by 1945, almost an icon of American military presence. It appeared in American propaganda photographs and newsreels. It was the vehicle most associated with American GIs in the public imagination. For German soldiers, seeing Jeeps became synonymous with seeing Americans, and by 1945, seeing Americans meant confronting an enemy with effectively unlimited resources. The Jeep's design philosophy also revealed something about American military culture that Germans found both puzzling and disturbing. American forces seemed almost indifferent to specialized optimization. They used the same basic vehicle for everything, regardless of whether it was optimal for specific tasks. They accepted the inefficiencies this created, using an overbuilt reconnaissance vehicle for liaison work, using a heavy cargo vehicle for missions that required only minimal payload. But they didn't care, because they had so many that inefficiency didn't matter. This represented a fundamentally different relationship to military equipment than German forces maintained. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized using the right tool for each specific job, specialized vehicles for specialized roles, carefully allocated based on unit mission requirements. This made sense when production was limited and every vehicle had to justify its existence. American doctrine simply distributed vehicles in such quantities that specialization became unnecessary. Need to move supplies? Use a Jeep. Need to scout? Use a Jeep. Need to mount a radio? Use a Jeep. The versatility of having one good enough vehicle in massive quantities outweighed the theoretical advantages of having multiple specialized vehicles in limited numbers. German officers, struggling to scrape together enough operational vehicles to maintain basic mobility, watched American units discard damaged Jeeps by the roadside, not worth the time to recover when replacements were so readily available. This disposal of still repairable equipment would have been unconscionable in German logistics, where every vehicle was precious, and mechanics performed miracles to keep aging trucks operational. Americans simply abandoned anything that couldn't be fixed in an hour, knowing another Jeep would arrive soon. This abundance mentality pervaded American operations in ways that went far beyond vehicles. German soldiers who captured American supply dumps found quantities of material that seemed impossible: rations stacked floor to ceiling in vast warehouses, ammunition in mountains of crates, medical supplies in quantities sufficient for entire divisions, gasoline in tank farms that could fuel armies. American forces seemed to operate under the assumption that logistics would never be a constraint, that whatever they needed would simply be available. And the terrifying reality was that this assumption proved correct. American supply lines functioned with a reliability that German forces could barely comprehend. American units received regular resupply regardless of weather, terrain, or tactical situation. American soldiers expected hot meals, dry socks, cigarettes, mail from home, all delivered with mechanical regularity. When American units needed ammunition, it arrived. When they needed fuel, it arrived. When they needed vehicles or weapons or equipment, it arrived. German forces had learned to operate under constant scarcity. Units went days without resupply. Soldiers fought on reduced rations. Vehicles sat immobile for lack of fuel. Artillery conserved shells. The Luftwaffe grounded aircraft because pilots were irreplaceable. Every resource was precious, every expenditure carefully calculated, every loss a permanent diminishment of capability. The Americans simply had more of everything. And that abundance was enabled by industrial capacity, the same capacity that produced 600,000 Jeeps alongside everything else modern war required. The Jeep became, in some ways, the perfect symbol of this disparity. Small enough to be non-threatening, common enough to be constantly visible, simple enough to be clearly understood, yet undeniably superior in performance to its German equivalent. Every German soldier who saw one, drove one, or fought against one, had to confront the same uncomfortable truth. If America could do this with a simple utility vehicle, what did it mean for tanks, aircraft, ships, artillery, all the weapons that actually determined battles? Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.